Okay, so this is Movie Thoughts. I'm John Hastings, and this is just a quick um, addendum to that last episode, episode 24. Um, and so if you're, I think I'm actually just going to, if you're listening to this on the podcast, I think I'm just going to tack it on to the end. So it seems like it's all the same episode, but it's a separate video right now. So when I titled that episode, which was really, the episode 24 was really my sequel to my episode on the American New Wave and New Hollywood, and looking at the way New Hollywood has come to mean something in the consensus version of American film history, and me trying to like push back a bit against that consensus vision for the purpose of not just to kind of tear something down or to be contrarian for my own sake, but for the purpose of trying to shift the spotlight to movies that I think are under recognized for their interest and for their artistic greatness and for their kind of um, thematic ambitions. So, having said that, when I went to do the second episode or the sequel episode, which is kind of looking at how that myth of New Hollywood and the greatness of American movies in the late 60s and early 70s, kind of the aftermath of it, some of the after other effects it's had. And one of them I argued in that episode and the earlier episode, and then expanded on in episode 24, was this idea that the 80s represent the films that came after the New Hollywood in America represent this kind of falling off, or like this kind of wasteland, a expulsion from the Eden of New Hollywood into this kind of corporate mainstream blockbuster wasteland. And I wanted to maybe just my purpose in episode 24 was to kind of complicate that and to push back against it. But then when I went to give it a title, I said, oh, this is why I think the movies of the 1980s are better than the movies of the 1970s, which was being provocative, to be fair. But it gets back to that point I made in my episode about these better than conversations, and one of them is that kind of whenever we have these kind of better than, Scorsese is better than De Palma, or Chaplin is better than Keaton, or vice versa, whichever side you want to take, they're sort of pointless and arbitrary, and you can look at it in that way. They're these goofy arguments. Movies are not sports. Like, it's not like we're having to argue like which Yankees team is better, where at least there, when you're making those type of arguments in sports, there's a little bit more objective data you can use. Some of those arguments get pretty goofy too, but it's less goofy in sports, and then taking that sports context to film or any type of art, is really goofy. But there, in that episode on Better Than, I made tried to make the argument that I actually think they can be useful or interesting as a way to clarify, underlying values, or to kind of clarify underlying aesthetic or critical stances. So when by putting things in the frame of, I think the 80s are better than the 70s in terms of movies. On the one hand, I was being provocative, but on the other hand, I was trying to kind of draw out, or in the episode, I was hoping to draw out some of the questions of the values underneath those judgments. Although I didn't do, I didn't necessarily do as good a job in episode 24 as I would have liked to. I should have started with this kind of context really before going into my main argument. That might have helped. So I'm giving the context late. I'm giving it at the end, but I'm giving it. So one thing I'd say is, as I said with the episode on De Palma, or the Better Than episode, where I said I thought De Palma was better than Scorsese. A lot of these questions, a lot of the most interesting questions to me, are ones where you really could, a reasonable person who's seen a bunch of movies could make an argument for either side. And my suggestion in that episode was, I get why most people pick Scorsese over De Palma, and also I don't think it's at all crazy to go the opposite direction. And if I had to choose, that's what I would choose: De Palma over Scorsese. But I think both sides make a lot of sense. I think it's not crazy to choose De Palma, despite what some people kind of were saying, that I was crazy or just being contrarian to choose De Palma. I think this is a similar case here, with kind of looking at the 1970s versus the 1980s. Like, I think you can make very strong arguments, and the consensus vision of the consensus version of that argument made by, as I mentioned, Steve Weinberg in his book No Surprises, Please, I think is a pretty strong, powerful argument vision of that story that the 1980s were depressing in terms of movies. If you had, especially if you had lived through the 1970s and were a movie buff and were trying to look for something to see every week at the movies in America, it would have been really depressing. So I think that's a strong argument. I think there's a lot of truth to it. I would, and what I would just want to do is push, as I did in that episode, just push back against that idea that that's the only way we need to look at things, or the only perspective we need to take is, what if I was an American, film buff in the 1980s? I probably would be depressed. But I don't think we need to take that perspective anymore. And so the kind of values, I think, or the underlying value issue that I think you get at by kind of looking at it in the, at least if not looking at it, if not agreeing with me, at least kind of standing in my shoes, or the kind of point of view that I was trying to present in that episode 24, kind of saying like, okay, so what are the values underneath that? What if it's true? Let's pretend it's a close call. Even if you think it's not a close call, I think it's a pretty close call. Let's pretend you do think it's a close call. What are the values underneath that, and what's my point of trying to like bring those out? And that has to do again with this idea, specifically this idea of relevance, like this idea that the centrality to the conversation, or the number of people you can talk about a movie with, or like whether it's a water cooler movie or not, is important. And I think that's, I kind of think that's not important. I think it shouldn't be important, or I think it's overvalued. I'm not going to say it's not important. That's too hyperbolic. Although I'm being hyperbolic all over the place, but saying it's not important is too hyperbolic. But saying that it's maybe over important or overly important compared to other values, I think is very defensible, and is true. I would argue that for sure. This gets back to something, you know, uh, uh, when I think about discussion of movies on the internet in general, going back to the beginning. I wasn't, using that in message boards and all that stuff. What was kind of promising about discussing movies on the internet for a long time, was kind of exciting about it, was that it was in a lot of ways a place that relevance of that sort was not valued it was certainly valued, but not to that high of an extent necessarily. And you had lots of places on the internet where people could really were talking about movies based, discovering their own interests, and kind of driven by their own interest, and not driven by this idea that they need to be part of a larger cultural conversation. So you got a lot of interesting work on the fringes. And I think about the beginning of, I have the clearest memories of the beginning of blogging, where you had a blog like, for example, the self-styled siren, where she's really just not she's not trying to like talk about the important movies of today, or keep up with what the conversation is about movies. She's really just exploring her own interests in a certain type of old Hollywood movie. And that was exciting and good, because it was a voice that wasn't in, you wouldn't necessarily find that voice in the mainstream of film criticism, or the mainstream of film discourse. So that was pretty exciting. You saw that all over the internet in all sorts of ways. Just this idea that we don't have to like be relevant. And unfortunately, as time went on, the people talking about movies on the internet switched to wanting to be relevant and part of this bigger conversation. And I don't want to blame Twitter, but I think that might have been a part of it. This idea that, we all need to, there's these movies that we all need to have reactions about, and we're going to be reacting about each other's reactions about these a particular set of movies. So, anyways, that's sort of a digression, but my point in bringing up this topic about the 80s versus the 70s is in part based on my thoughts around these values, that this relevance is overly valued, and we should take the opportunity to push back against it if we can. The other thing I would point out is, I do think that most of the people who've kind of have commented to me about my episode 24 so far have really picked up on my denigration of or my seeming denigration of New Hollywood. And like I say, I think it's really close. I love those movies of New Hollywood. I think they're great. Have No one's really kind of come up to defend Goonies, which is good. On the other hand, I think that you really I think the episode 24, the argument makes sense if you really look at both sides of the both myths that I was trying to deconstruct. And I think both, again, do rely on a sort of cognitive distortion. In the one myth, the New Hollywood falling off myth, the expulsion from Eden, the no surprises please myth, you have a overly negative vision of the 1980s, and maybe because you lived through it and you just have negative memories of what it was like to go to the movies in that era, which is perfectly okay. I completely understand that. I would, if that was my experience, it might be hard for me to break out of it too. And then but it's really just the same thing on the opposite side of things happening with the nostalgia, my childhood group, which is like, oh, I saw Goonies when I was 10, so it was this amazing experience. So I still have to talk about how great Goonies is on the internet. Uh, and I think in both cases you get this cognitive distortion that's making it hard to see, to kind of see the reality of what the actual breadth and scope of artistic offerings in cinema of the 1980s has to offer. So you can say like, well, why does that matter? Who cares really? Like, why? What does it matter if people have this skewed vision? Oh, well, because I think we we don't just value, because, and this maybe it goes you know a little bit paradoxical, because I was just kind of arguing kind of against this idea of relevance, but we kind of need stories to make sense of individual pieces of data. We need theories or theories to make sense of individual pieces of data. So we don't, we have a good story for why we have this great flowering of artistic masterpieces in the early 70s coming out of Hollywood, New Hollywood. We don't have a great story necessarily for why we have a similar kind of flowering of great horror movie masterpieces coming out of you know Hollywood adjacent environs. Not all from Hollywood, some from like Canada with David Cronenberg. We don't have as good necessarily a good story about that, but I think it's a pretty good story. I think it's an important story. So I think by shifting the way we think about this, shifting the stories we're telling, it allows us actually to give a more proper value to those movies. It lets us see movies that might have slipped through the crack, or we might think of as just like outliers or edge cases, as actually being kind of important and central, and allows us gives us a chance to reevaluate them. It also pushes back against this idea that things are always getting worse, which both the kind of my childhood and the New Hollywood No Surprises Please narrative kind of have in their own way. One, that No Surprises Please is that they got worse in the 80s, and the my childhood is like, oh, they got worse after my childhood. And I think both of those things are distortions and wrong, and kind of lead to being more depressed than you'd need to be. I often think that a big part of when people tell me like movies today aren't good, or they're not as interested in movies today, and then I list like about a dozen movies that I think are pretty terrific from recent years. People are like, well, I've never heard of those, or I didn't really, that wasn't really interesting. I didn't really want to see it. That didn't seem interesting to me. And it's like, well, it's easy to say things have gotten worse if you're just not engaging with the good stuff that is out there. And we can talk about, there's completely legitimate conversations about like, why is it harder to find the good stuff? Why is the good stuff harder to make? Why, if you're a filmmaker trying to make good stuff, is getting more and more difficult? Those are all, true, interesting things we can talk about. But this kind of just depressing sort of downer vibe, I don't think it does really, is that interesting, essentially. Not, I don't know if it's like it does people any good, or it acts as like a defense mechanism. Who knows? But I don't think it's that interesting. It's kind of boring after a while. So I think it might be better to, or I think it's useful. Better is maybe too judgmental. I think it's useful to again push back against some of these narratives that assume that everything is kind of getting worse and falling apart. And there's obviously sometimes things are getting worse. Sometimes things are falling apart. But when we we have the opportunity, at least in this case, when we're talking about the movies of the 1980s, to step back and say, like, well, how bad could an era be when it gives you movies like Taipei Story and The Night of the Shooting Stars and Videodrome and Blue Velvet? That still something was working, something was happening, something was going right. I think that's about all I have to say for today. And thanks again for listening. Take care.